Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Church Leadership Podcast. We're so glad that you have joined us for today's conversation, and it is going to be an awesome one. We're here with a good friend, and before we get to that conversation, though, I want to remind you of a couple things. Our mission here at Church Leadership Podcast is to encourage and equip you to lead in the local church, and we believe every single episode can help you do just that, whether it's one statement, one sentence, one part of our conversation, or the whole thing. We want it to be an encouragement to you and to give you practical tools to lead in the local church, whether you're a pastor, staff member, or a volunteer leader. And we're glad you're here for this ride, for this today's episode. And if you've not been listening to our episode, our podcast for long, go back and listen to past episodes. We've got new people joining all the time, and we're glad you're here. And we would encourage you to subscribe to our podcast. If you're like me, you probably only listen to podcasts that you subscribe to because there's so much going on and you don't get reminded. So hit that subscribe button, whether you're listening to it or watching it on YouTube, so you don't miss a single episode. Now, here is today's conversation.
Wow, guys, thank you for joining us. It is the end of the year as we're recording this podcast. It's almost Christmas, just a few days away, and we're thankful that Jeremy Jones has found some time in his busy schedule to join us. Jeremy is our friend. We've known him for several years now. He's just a great guy, doing a great job serving where he's at. He is the senior pastor at Bethsalem Baptist Church in Billingsley, Alabama, which is just south of Birmingham. And we've known Jeremy for a while, and we're thankful for his investment in disciple making and what God is doing in and through you. Jeremy, thank you so much for taking time to join us on the podcast this week.
Glad to be here. Excited that you could, I'm probably the only one you could find this close to Christmas, right?
Not at all. Speaking of the reason, really, there's lots of reasons we wanted you on today. One is because our relationship with you. You're a friend of ours. And secondly, Andy mentioned it, your commitment to making disciples. And third really is, I think your experience over the last year is a really common one. So I'll let you tell the folks listening and watching about it, but you were a student pastor for years and years, and you served faithfully in that role. God blessed your ministry as a student pastor. But over the last year now, you have just celebrated your year anniversary there at Bethsalem. So you have transitioned from student pastor, second chair, to being a lead pastor or a senior pastor. And so we wanted to talk to you about that because, again, that's a common experience for a lot of people. And so I want you to start by telling us a little bit about that journey and maybe some things that surprised you or some lessons you've learned over this past year in that transition.
Yeah, it's been a journey. Absolutely. In my mind, if you'd asked me 5 years ago if I'd be a senior pastor, I'd have told you you're crazy. I never had a desire. I wanted to build a student ministry and invest in students. And, it was amazing just the time how God just began to just change me and mold me and put people in my life like Robert Mullins. He was my pastor and I served with him, and he's the one who saw it in me way before I saw it and just continued to encourage and challenge me. But it was kind of interesting as bad as COVID was for me, I don't know if I would be here if it wasn't for COVID. And the reason is it was an opportunity for me to kind of step back, reflect, and just spend time with the Lord. And that's really the beginning of COVID. March, April of 2020 was when God began to really shift my focus from student ministry to being a senior pastor. And it was a day the church was shut down. Me and Robert just happened to be at the office at the same time and had a conversation. And and I let him know what God had been dealing with me and said, I think I really believe God's doing this. And he stepped in and kind of gave me some guidance as far as who to talk to, guys to have some lunch with, to just begin to that process. And, it was a journey from March, really April, all the way until, I guess began in about August. And, I shared with you guys earlier, I had a conversation with Mike Jackson and at the Alabama State Board of Missions, and had lunch with him. And while I was having lunch with him, he reminded me and let me know that he was the interim pastor at Bethsalem. Would I be interested in possibly at that church? And I actually wrote in my journal that day that I really believe that this moment and this lunch I had with him, God had ordained it, and I would look back on it as a beginning of a new journey in my ministry. And a month and a half later, I get a phone call from them, and the rest is history. I'm now the senior pastor at Bethsalem Baptist Church. And so it's been an interesting journey because it was right in the middle of COVID. It was right in the middle of all of that, which seems like a crazy time to transition. But it was actually a perfect time to transition, because when I became the pastor, they were doing one thing. They were having worship on Sunday morning. That was it. There was no Wednesday night services, no Sunday school. I mean, it was it. And so for me, it was kind of nice to be able to just slowly get into the ministry and what's happening here. So I wasn't all of a sudden had to do 3 messages in a week and all these crazy things. I was able to bring back all the things that I felt led God was bringing back and institute, and, did some crazy things like flip the service. They had done 9:30 worship from June of 2020 to when I came, and we kind of began to meet and talk about when we were going to bring Sunday school back and all of those things. And we kept worship at 9:30 and put Sunday school at 10:30. And we have continued to do that since. And the flip has been great. We have 80 to 90% attendance in Sunday school because worship is first and then they stay around. And so just little things like that. It's been a journey, but the biggest thing I've learned is just, and it's a hard one, is patience. And just waiting on God's timing. Because there was a moment from that time I wrote that in June 26th till I didn't get a phone call till August 16th. And I'm wondering, okay, God, I know my heart was in Bethsalem. It really was. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm wrong. And so I just waited, and I wrote many times in my journal, and I don't journal as much as I should. Now I had the time to journal. It became a habit of what I did. And so that journaling, I can go back, and it's fun to go back and see how God began to work and move and change things. And so kind of that's where just being patient through it, waiting on God's timing, which is hard. We want things now. We want to move in our society, and everything we're around it's the immediate gratification, immediate answers. And that waiting for, from the time that God began to move, and I know he was calling me a senior pastor, was, I guess, 9 months. And, that whole journey, but it was preparing me and getting me ready to take that next step. And so, just waiting on God's timing. It's always perfect. It's always on time, but it's hard for us to wait because we want to see what's happening, and just trusting God, that whole dive into God's word and letting it be a light into my path and a lamp into my feet. I can't see beyond that. I just trust in him day by day, moment by moment. And some days we're not always easy to trust and to wait, but it's, to see it in the hindsight, it's like, oh, I see how God just orchestrated it all. But in the midst of it, I was wondering many days, what's next? Is this the right move? All those things.
Jeremy, you said it was an 8 or 9 month journey to kind of prepare you. Obviously, we know it was your whole time in ministry, your whole life, everything God uses in our life to prepare us for what's next. And thinking about that transition, as Mark mentioned, there's a lot of transitioning in ministry right now. People are moving out of full-time ministry into bivocational or co-vocational ministry. Some guys are even transitioning roles like you did. They're either taking on the lead pastor role or some other role in their church simply because of restructuring and budgeting in their churches. So people are really in that mindset right now. You're talking about, you had time to think. We've all had time to really think and evaluate what our future should look like. And even now, a lot of people are really, really considering that. Seeing as it didn't take 2 or 3 months just to get over the hump of a pandemic, we're still smack dab in the middle of it with a new variant that's just popped its ugly head up right now. So tell us a little bit about what are some things that maybe you look back and see prepared you to take the role that you have now? What are some things that helped you? And maybe even you're welcome to mention some things that have caught you off guard that you weren't ready for, transitioning from one role to another and serving in the church.
And I know this is really crazy to say, but there's not much that's caught me off guard. And I really thought there would be, but I think a lot of that, it was not only definitely not as much my preparation as what my church, previous church, Crossroads Community Church, had done with Robert to allow me to do so many things in ministry. And I think I wasn't just a youth pastor. It wasn't compartmentalized. And this is my student ministry and the church happens over here. I was very much immersed in the ministry and what the church was doing, the direction, the decisions. And so I was able to get a kind of a holistic picture of the church and be a part of that ministry. And I think that's the struggle that a lot of times is we compartmentalize the ministries instead of understanding our student ministry is great, but they need to understand, the students need to see, what is the church about? Why are we moving this direction? And so I was able to, for the years I was there. Now, if you'd have said the first 5-6 years I was there at Crossroads, I would have not been able to say that. I was being there also almost 17 years kind of helped, because I saw the church go through many different transitions. I've seen it walk through many different and been a part of a lot of the things from leadership and administrative things. And I think that's the biggest thing is anybody wanting to transition, you've got to understand the whole church and why, so when I stepped in to be the senior pastor, leader of the whole church, I had already done a lot of those things, and I think as pastors, and that's one thing I'm trying to be is, for anybody under my leadership, is to allow them to be a part of the ministry and serving, because that's what Robert did for me. He is very much a team leader and utilizes the team approach, where it's not him doing everything and this is you follow me. It's let's go together. And I think that mentality helped prepare me to understand all the things that inner workings of the church. And so that's kind of, to me, been a great part of my transition, is being a part and seeing and doing all aspects of the church, from the janitorial stuff, whether it's, helping clean up or put up stuff, or senior adults, the Sunday school ministry, discipleship ministry, disciple making, all those things kind of helped me be more well-rounded. So that's kind of what's been good for me as far as transitioning.
That's awesome.
Good.
I think that's an encouraging word for those who are in senior leadership, to think about how they're equipping and empowering those on their team, because it is easy just to try to delegate without empowering, and try to, just put people, in places because you get them to do ministry, but not, enable them and equip them to lead. And I think that's awesome. And Robert certainly did a huge service in doing that, but also taught you how to do it too. So that's awesome. Well, let me ask this question. You've been there a year, so you're probably still in the honeymoon phase a little bit. I mean, COVID probably prolonged that a little bit, but looking toward, we are at the end of the year now, but looking toward next year, what are some things that you're excited to do, that you feel like in this first year, maybe it was a little too soon, but some things maybe God has put on your heart and mind for your church and your ministry there at Bethsalem?
I think for me is implementing the disciple making culture. I've this year, because of COVID, because of all that, I've kind of sat back and tried to learn my culture, learn the environment, learn the people, and what avenues are going to be the best way to go about that. And that's been good, because if I'd have just implemented the way I've always done it at Crossroads, it would not have been as probably effective. You got to understand your church culture, your church local predicament. Everything's different. There's a lot of similarities between Bethsalem and Crossroads, which is kind of cool, in that we're more regional. Where most folks come from all over the place, and I learned that at Crossroads, because that's what it went from a hopeful church to a regional church, and seeing that. But I think for me is kind of beginning to implement that and beginning to make disciples who make disciples, and understanding that, because I've talked about it. We've put it out there. The thing I kind of go with is trying to change it up and not be the same that, we did at Crossroads, whatever, is, just making it simple, love and lead. God calls us to love God, love people, and to lead others to love God and love people. And, I talk about it a lot and they hear it, but that true implementation of the messy disciple making, is what I'm excited about in the future.
That's awesome.
It is awesome.
Jeremy, Mark just asked you, what kind of things are you looking forward to? Let me ask you this. What kind of advice would you give someone who maybe they're contemplating the same kind of decision? Maybe they're transitioning from one role to another, or one church to another, or maybe somebody's fresh out of seminary, or maybe somebody is starting their new church. What kind of advice would you give them as they're about to head into their first year of ministry?
I guess, don't get ahead of yourself. I was fortunate because I was allowed that opportunity to take a little bit of time, like I talked about, because of COVID, because it was so slow. But I think taking a year and taking some time to get to know the people, to invest in them. And, as you transition, it's just waiting on God. As hard as it is waiting on his leadership, his timing is so paramount for me. I could have, tried to push it faster and maybe done some things through my transition period, but I really wanted to go to the place that God wanted me to be. And man, it is just, God fitted me in a place that fits my personality. I connect with the people well, the community. It's a great fit. And it's because I waited on God. And, there were some other opportunities I could have pursued, but I didn't, because I didn't feel God lead in that direction. And so I think the biggest thing is truly walk in the Spirit, walk where God's leading you. Even if it sounds crazy, even if it's smaller, bigger, it doesn't matter. Just go where God wants you to go. Because the best place to be is where God wants you to be. Because if you're, the thing I know, I look back is I know if I stayed at Crossroads, I would be miserable right now. Completely, because it's not where God wants me. God has me here. And I think that's why there's been some great things. My family, how God worked through my family is crazy. I mean, when I moved to Bethsalem to be the senior pastor, I had a 16 and 18-year-old. I had a junior and senior in high school. That's not the normal time to move, is in the middle of your senior year, of your daughter's senior year. But the transition, because God was in it, they actually have thrived. And my oldest daughter has, she became a leader here and really took off and has taken on some leadership and speaks up. And that's just not her personality. God's just really using that. And it's just really cool how both of my daughters just transitioned right into the church and love it. And, that's only God to move them as a junior and a senior to a new church, a new youth group. I'm no longer their youth pastor. That's all they've ever known. They never knew anybody else to be youth pastor, because their entire life, when I came to Crossroads, Lily was 2 weeks old. Abby was 1.5 years. So they really, truly don't know what another church looks like. They didn't know what another ministry looked like. But for them to transition so smoothly was pretty amazing.
That is awesome. And that's encouraging to hear. We always try to close out on something encouraging. That is it. I mean, and you didn't mention it until right there at the end. But I mean, that tells you were at Crossroads for what, 17 years as a second chair guy, student pastor. And sometimes I think that's an encouragement too. I think, some second chair leaders get a little bit antsy when they see some things that they would change and maybe they would do different now. Okay, it's time for me. And, I had a little bit of that in me. And I think it's wise of you to stay and to learn until God has you ready. And man, you are ready. And we're thankful for you, for your ministry. And I did not mention this to begin with, but there's also another reason we had you on this podcast. And so for those watching and listening, he's also a fellow Troy alum. And so go Trojans.
I knew it was coming up. I knew it.
You knew that was coming up. So, I mean, it's always good to have another Trojan on the podcast.
Oh, absolutely.
But
Y'all seem to be in a good mood since you've gotten a new coach too. So
That's right. That's right. There's good things to look forward to. That's right.
I mean, Mark's beaming. I mean, I think he's just
Yeah.
giddy about next year.
Yeah. I mean, some people have accused me of having a man crush, and I'm maybe.
Well,
not
they've
denying
also
it.
accused you of crushing the former coach's dreams and hopes too.
Well, I don't have enough money to do that. But anyway, Jeremy, thank you so much, man, for being here and for just sharing with us. And I know there's no doubt in my mind that people listening to this conversation, even if they don't know you, even if they never met you, they are encouraged and equipped to lead, either in a second chair or in a lead role like you are doing and have been doing. So thank you so much for being with us.
I enjoyed it, man. Thank you guys for having me on. It was an honor.
Yeah, Mark, I echo what you said. Jeremy, I thank you for your faithfulness to Jesus and his church. And man, what a great, encouraging testimony of what God's doing in your life right now and your family. We really appreciate your sharing your story today.
Yep. And for everybody else, thank you again so much for loyally being a part of this podcast. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.